Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I am here to talk about deck modifications. Specifically, we're going to talk about using markers to edge your decks. Now we'll talk a little bit about some of the different reasons why and some of the techniques that we might use for edging our decks, and then I will do a little tutorial using different types of markers to edge decks so that you can see how they work and how each one affects the cardstock and how it's applied. So to begin with, let's talk about some of the reasons why we might want to edge a deck. Now the first reason is strictly for aesthetics. Now you take a deck such as the Darkness of Light here, or here I have the Tarot of the She. So when you have a deck that is dark, particularly the darker ones, but not always necessarily, so you have this dark front, you have this dark back, and then sometimes it just leaves it a little unfinished looking to have those stark white edges. So when you take a deck like this and then you edge it in a darker color, such as I've done with my Darkness of Light, you get this beautiful finished edging. So it just kind of looks like a more finished product. It blends together much nicer than those stark white edges that this deck originally came with. So aesthetics is probably one of the main reasons that people edge decks. It makes them look more finished, it gives them a pop of color, and it adds a little bit of personality, and it's a great way to bond with your deck. So another reason we might want to edge our decks is to refresh a deck that's been pretty well used and the edges are starting to look a little frayed. So you can see here, this deck is one of my, or was my first deck that I ever purchased, and you can see that it has been very well used and that the edges are starting to chip and the sides look pretty worn and frayed. Now in some decks this looks really good because it gives them an aged sort of antique-y look. On this deck, a dark deck like this, or some of a more modern looking decks, it doesn't do anything aesthetically to help it out to have those worn edges on there. It just looks old and used. So edging a deck is a great way to refresh those edges and kind of cover up some of that chipping and blemishing that you get on some of your older decks. So another reason that we might want to edge our decks is to finish off a deck that you have trimmed. So when you trim a deck, you do not get these stark, nice, finished edging like you do with a machine cut deck. Unless you're like just really precise about it, and most of us just really don't have the time and the effort to be quite that precise. So generally when you edge a deck, you get a little bit of a rough edge to it. Now you can take a nail file and very, very gently run it along the edges to remove some of that excess that you might have. But for the most part, if you just color your edges, it covers it up beautifully. So real quickly, let's talk about some of the benefits of markers over some other different edging techniques, such as like stamps. So the biggest benefit to markers is the quicker drying time. So in general, that means that once you edge a deck, you can usually use it pretty quickly right away. Some of the art markers do not dry as quick as, say, a Sharpie does. But that quick drying time in general for markers means that generally you don't have a long wait time between when you edge your deck and when you can use your deck. The other biggest benefit to markers is that they do come in a variety of styles and colors. So depending on what kind of look you want, you can get markers pretty much in any color to match any deck. So the biggest drawbacks to markers is that quicker drying time means that your markers are less forgiving. So when you do make a mess, or when you do have accidental bleed overs, you know, you're going along and you're edging your deck and you whoops down the side of it. Some markers, you're done. It's not going to come off. Again, depends on the marker. So it's really important to test your markers before you begin. So quicker drying time, lots more variety in colors, but you have to balance that out with it being a little bit less forgiving and with a higher tendency to bleed. So now let's look at the different types of markers. So there are 5 basic types of markers, and I do only have 4 of them represented here because I do only have 4 or use 4 of them. So the first and most obvious that most people use is Sharpie. Now Sharpie is a great inexpensive, quick marker to use. I have to be honest and say it is not my favorite because of the way that it bleeds. So here we have everybody's favorite. It's black Sharpie. It works great and looks great on just about every card. I didn't mean works great because it doesn't always. The great thing about this bad boy is that this thing covers like phenomenally. Now the one thing I want to note is that you will always see me hold the card front away from me and the card back towards me. That is to ensure that if I get any bleed, I'm going to get it on the back and not the front, because while sometimes a micro border on the back is okay, most of the time I don't want it on the front. So we're just going to take this and we're going to keep it angled toward the back, and we're just going to go and see, look what I just did. That's not going to come off. That's going to smear on there, and there we go. This is why I don't like Sharpie. So I'm just going to go through, and I did it again because my elbow is not on the table. That's another thing. Be sturdy. Put your elbows down. Get your elbows into it. Anyway, while this covers beautifully, this big old Sharpie marker covers beautifully, it makes a bit of a mess on the card. Now this I have used on decks where you have a black front and a black back, or you have a black border on both. It works fine for that because you cannot see this messy overlay. And as you can see, that's dry already, so that's just too bad there. If this was a deck I was working with, that's what I would end up with. Okay, so that is black Sharpie, but you can see that it covers really well. It's got that Sharpie smell, which some people love, and honestly gives me a headache, and that's another reason why I don't use Sharpie. So we're gonna set that guy aside. Another favorite is these Sharpie metallics. So they have them in bronze, and there's gold, and there's you know, silver. So we have quite a few options. They're always coming out with more all the time. So this one we would just take, and we're gonna very carefully, and part of the problem is I'm trying to do this with the camera in my way. So there you go, and you can see I kind of went back and touched up the corners a little bit just to make sure I was getting it well covered. So there you have it in Sharpie. You can see because I was angled towards the back and working with the card back towards me, I didn't get any bleed on the front, which is gorgeous. And I only got the slightest little bit of bleed on the back. So next you can also get Sharpie in various colors, and they are coming out with more and more colors every day. This works really similar to your metallic Sharpies, and I have used these from time to time to add in some detail work. So again, and if you'll notice, I tend to use my pinky as like a backstop for my card, just so I'm trying to stay on the card, which is another problem I have with that gigantic Sharpie, is that it's hard for me to create a center point or a balance point. Now you can see with this really bright Sharpie, I'm getting really vibrant color. There you go. So that is, yeah, what happens with Sharpie. So let's go back and take a look and get real close in on refocus. You can see there's a little bit of bleed there, and this is the bronze Sharpie. So you can see not too bad. And here was the pink on the front. So I forgot to show you that. So you can see quite a bit of bleed. Now if you're looking for that sort of messy look, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I have had decks that I've actually done that on purpose because I wanted that messy look. And here's our Sharpie Magnum. And this thing, woo, is a hot mess. Look at that. And it stinks. I can smell the Sharpie from here. And I got bleed on the front, like you can see. Now again, if you're working with a card that has a black back and a black front, say that 4 times fast, you know, bleeding over black isn't going to be a big deal. And I have edged decks with this Sharpie because it's super fast. So Sharpie is a wonderful, quick and easy marker to pick up. It's cheap, it's affordable, it's everywhere, and they are coming out with more and more colors of Sharpie all the time. The next alternative is your art markers. So these are the ones that are generally, they are alcohol based, and they are archival quality, so they will do less damage to your cards and they will hold up better over time, generally speaking. The art markers tend to be a little bit more expensive, and they do have a tendency to bleed front or back. But it does depend on the art marker, because while this particular marker does bleed on the back, I have another one in a black that doesn't. So it just depends on the marker itself. Now let's jump into our art markers. So this is my favorite black, and this one is about done. I'm gonna go ahead and use it anyway for this tutorial, but really it's like, it's so chiseled, or it's been so it's been so worn in that it's got really deep grooves in it, so I'm really trying not to hit those grooves. But that's the other thing you can do, is if you start getting a marker that's super grooved, turn it flat ways. Sometimes that works even better. It can be a little bit harder to keep it on the card, but sometimes when you start getting those grooves, it's just a way to get a little bit more life out of a marker. Turn it flat ways. Now generally I would be doing it like this, but this marker is so heavily grooved, I know if I do that, here watch, I'll do it. If I do that, I'm definitely gonna get a border because I'm now way deep into that groove. So that is the Prismacolor. So this is the art marker. So you can see down here, this is where I did it the proper way with my edge. But you can see, because it's so grooved, I've got that overlay to it, and this is where I was doing it along the side. Because this marker is so grooved, I'm getting a little bit of a bleed. I generally wouldn't get this much bleed with this type of marker, but I need to order me a new one because I've done so many decks. And that's another thing, you know, I wouldn't suggest spending a huge amount of money on your markers, because I mean, you got to figure out how many decks you can get done with them, and is it worth the cost? Which is something I'm going to get to here in a moment with some more of these markers. So this is an art alternative marker, and it is like a generic, it's a generic Copic, if you're familiar with Copics. It's just a generic art marker. They're about $2–3 where I live for them, and they cover really well. And as you can tell, with some of these lighter colors, I'm kind of just giving it more than one pass. And again, just depends on how it's going to cover. This is why we test first, right? So there is, whoops, throwing that around. There is the art marker. And as you can see, I did get a little bit of bleed. If it would focus. And there's some good purple bleed right there. So this is one of those markers that it does bleed a little bit, not near as bad as like a Sharpie has a tendency to bleed, but it's fairly minimal when you consider some of the other alternatives. So next we have another just art marker. This is a Blick Studio marker, which is a local shop for in Portland. And so for this one, I'm just gonna go through, and this one has quite a powerful smell as well. It's not as bad as Sharpie, but it's got a pretty good odor to it. And that's another thing you want to keep in mind, because you're gonna have to do this for 78 cards. So you probably want to make sure that it doesn't stink so bad it gives you a headache, which is another reason why I won't use Sharpie. So you can see with this one, I didn't get hardly any bleed on the back, and very little bleed. I did get a little bit up in the corner here on the front. And this is a pale green, so it's going to be hard to see on camera. But so that is 3 different types of art markers. Now I'm going to talk real quick about these are this is a Copic marker, or Copic, depending on how you say it. And this is another great art marker. I honestly cannot tell you how it works on cards, because I will not use these on my cards. These are very expensive, and my daughter and I use them for actual art, like actually, you know, drawing and coloring and things like that for art projects. So I do not touch our stash of Copics for edging decks. But I did want to point out that, you know, they are available. It's just this marker eventually is going to end up looking like, you know, looking like this one, all chewed up, made with many, many grooves. And when it starts getting really groovy like that, it's probably about time to pass it along. But Copics are also, you know, a great marker. I'm assuming they work great on decks. I would recommend, if you're looking for an art marker, go with either your more generic or your store brand, or even, you know, your higher end Prismacolors or along those lines. Still not as expensive as your Copics. I can buy like 2 of these for the price of 1 of these. So just want to throw that out there as a thing. They do cover brilliantly most of the time, and the color is really usually rich and vibrant and makes for perfect edging on the card. This particular deck was not done in this one, it was done in my Prismacolor one, but look how beautiful and rich that black is. You don't always get that with a Sharpie. I have edged some blacks in some decks in black Sharpie, and I've had to do a couple coats to get that deep, rich black color. Now, one of the types of markers that I think is sorely overlooked is your standard Crayola or just your plain old kids markers. The huge benefit to like a Crayola marker is you can get them in literally hundreds of colors. The other huge benefit to using a Crayola in particular, I cannot speak to other brands of kids type markers, but the Crayolas in particular do not bleed. I have edged quite a few decks with these, and I have yet to find a deck that it has bled on. Or I should say bled very badly, because it does, sometimes it does bleed a tiny bit, but it depends on the cardstock. So this deck in particular has been edged with multiple colors of Crayola markers, and you can see that despite the fact that I've got some lighter colors around the edges and that white, hopefully it will show up on camera, but I got very little, if any, bleed onto my title area. And of course the backs, which are dark anyway, don't have any bleed, but look how beautiful when you turn them sideways. Yeah. So let's take a look at our Crayolas, and I've picked just a couple of colors here just so you can see, and in particular I did want to show you the black. So again, I'm just gonna take this like here. These Crayolas cover beautifully, like they're even faster, I think, than the Sharpies. And they just go right along, and that big broad tip just stays right on there. So there you can see that, and like focus in. And you can see I got very little, if any, bleed onto the back. And same, very little bleed onto the front. And there's the beautiful sides. Look how pretty that is. I love the colors of the Crayolas. That's one of my favorite things about it. So that's the blue. Let's just go ahead and do this purple one real quick, just so we can see. We'll get a few colors going. So just gonna sit down here, and this is one of the things I love about Crayola is it's so quick. And you get those big vibrant colors in one swoop, and that is fabulous. Okay, so there we can see very little bleed. Actually, I don't think there's any bleed this time, and no bleed on the front. And look at that color. Sorry, the light is kind of funny. So let me just show you here. This is my Cosmic Tarot, and this is all Crayola. So look at those colors. They are bright and they are bold, and which was exactly what I wanted. All right, and I did want to show you that the Crayola black does also work pretty dang well. So we're just going to take this and bloop. This one has been used a little bit, and I have found that with the black, you kind of have to do a little bit of a back and forth to get it to cover up that white. It doesn't always love to cover up the white. It seems to work really well with the colors, but the black just has a little bit more of an issue, so you just kind of got to go back and forth a little bit with it. And there you go. And you can see we have a tiny bit of bleed with the black, and that's probably because I was doing that back and forth motion and I wasn't being super careful about it like I normally would. But you can see not too bad as far as the front, and there is the side. So we put the 3 of them together, and you can see there's our 3 colors. So Crayolas, a much overlooked marker. Now, the drawback to Crayola is that it is not archival and it is not permanent, so it will wear over time. But in my opinion, that just kind of gives you a chance to, you know, freshen up your deck once it starts to wear. Now I have done quite a few decks in Crayola, and I've done quite a few decks that I have used, and they still look great even several months later. So that being said, I have to recommend Crayola's pretty dang highly, especially if, you know, permanency and that archival quality isn't so, you know, important to you. They are not permanent. You know, this is a washable marker, so if you get these cards wet, I mean, it's gonna probably warp your cards anyway, but you will stand a chance of the ink kind of rubbing off. So far, the ink on any Crayola edge deck has not come off of my hands, and that's another thing that I have heard complaints about Sharpie, is that particularly the reds and the blacks, the darker colors, I have heard a lot of people complain that Sharpie can bleed back and rub onto your hands. So another great marker alternative is a highlighter. Now this is the mild liner brand of highlighters, and I get these in particular because they cover beautifully and I just love the colors that they're in. So the highlighters, and I'm using the mild liner to start with. So I'm gonna take, and these are actually getting a pretty decent groove in them now too, and I can see that one's bleeding really bad. Oh, here's another thing I love about the mild liners. Bleed, and I just wiped it right off. I have yet to find a deck that I can't wipe the bleed off from a mild liner. Bleed and wiped it off. Now your fingers are gonna get all colorful, but this is the only marker that I have found that you can do that with. And this one is really only bleeding so bad because it is pretty well grooved as well. And almost out of ink, so I probably should have picked a better marker. And again, now I've turned it flat side and I'm rubbing it that way, and look, I'm gonna take that and go, whoop, now it's gone. Look at my fingers though. I don't even know if it's focusing, but I'm having way too much fun talking about this stuff. I'm such a deck mod nerd. Okay, wipe off the excess, there you go. When they start getting that groove, it's probably time to get a new one. So here we go. You can see, if you can see my finger, that's what I wiped off the front. And I have found that you can do that with just about any cardstock and just about any mild liner. There's not any on the front. Now, had I not wiped it off, I would have had a small border because this one is heavily grooved, but let's go ahead and do the yellow real quick because this is one of my favorites and I have quite a few decks that I've edged in this color. So we're just gonna take it along. And this one is super grooved actually because I have done so many decks with it. It's a great base color, which is why I use it. So I'm gonna take that, and actually this time I'm gonna leave it on there so you can see it. I'm not gonna wipe it off, which kind of kills me, but so you can kind of get a little bit more life out of a chisel tip by using the two sides of it as well. So now since I didn't wipe that off, now you can see a little bit of the micro bleed that I got. Now generally, if it's a new mild liner, you're not going to get that much of a bleed. And I could have wiped it off because it comes right off. You just take your finger and, oh, look, it still came off. So now, let me take my finger. Generally, I do this with a paper towel. I don't use my fingers. But, well, sometimes I do. But I try not to because otherwise I'm going to get smudgy stuff on me. Anyway, see, now I wiped it all off. And that is one of the reasons I love the mild liners, because they just, when you get that excess, you can just wipe it right off. Because see, it's now all on my finger. Having said that, the mild liners do take a little bit longer to dry than the rest of these markers, which again is great because you can wipe off the excess. So the last one we're going to do is just a plain old highlighter, because if you want any bright vivid colors, these are fabulous. So I'm gonna just, because it's generally with the highlighter, you kind of have to go back and forth a little bit just to really get that color to sink in there. And I just wrote on it and wiped it back off. Another great thing about highlighter, did it again, wipe it right off. And as you can see, the highlighter, because you kind of got to go back and forth on it, is probably takes the longest of any of the markers. I think the quickest and cleanest is going to be your Crayola. Your quickest is going to be your fat old Sharpie, but I don't like the mess it makes, so Just wipe off any excess, which I don't know why I'm doing that because there isn't any. So there you have Sharpie, or sorry, highlighter, all mixed up. Nothing on the front, nothing on the back, and there's your pink color on the sides. Now the mild liners cover beautifully. They are vibrant for the most part, although, you know, a couple of them, they're pale because they're designed to be that way, but they cover beautifully, they stay in place, and they do not bleed front to back. Also, just standard old highlighters work wonderfully as well, and you get super vibrant colors with those. The last marker that I'm going to talk about is an oil-based marker, and I do not have oil-based markers because I do not use oil-based markers on my decks. So I can't really speak to the way they cover. I have heard some people say that they work great, but they just have a really long drying time. And I've heard other people say that they are definitely have some serious drawbacks in terms of how they apply onto the cards. Okay, so the next thing I want to discuss real quick is the different tip types, because that can make a difference on how the marker applies to your deck. So in general, you have 4 different types of tip types. Now there are pens that have different ones, but these are the general ones that you find most of the time. So the first is our chisel tip. And that is the tip that looks like this. It's got the angle to it. This is big and fat and it covers really well. The thing you have to watch about your chisel tips is that you, depending on where you have it on the card, you can make it bleed front or back depending on how you're holding it. So with your chisel tip, you do have to be a little bit more careful, but they cover really well. Your alternative to that, which these also, most of your art markers come with, is the brush tip. Now you can use a brush tip on your deck, but I have found that it doesn't work quite as well. You do get a bit more precision. So if you're doing something special, maybe doing some, you know, artwork on the side of your deck or something like that, the brush tip might be a better bet for you. But if you're just trying to do full-on coverage, your broad or your chisel tip is going to be your best. So then that brings us to our broad tip, which is like the Crayola marker has. So this is just a normal tip, but it's giant, it's big, it covers well. And I have found that it works really well on the cards, and it allows you a lot of precision because you don't have the tendency for that tip to wrap around the front. So these work really great for edging decks, and that's just your broad tip. Then you have your thinner type tips, and that would be this type of tip like you find on a Sharpie, which is just, it's similar to your broad one, but it's just a thinner tip. Or your super fine, like we see on this particular Sharpie. So your super fine ones are really great if you want to write back in titles or make notations on the cards themselves. I do not recommend them for edging because they're just not thick enough to cover the edge, and you're gonna get grooves in your markers. That is the other thing that I wanted to touch on real quick, is that I have a set of markers specifically for edging my decks, because when you edge a deck, after you've edged multiple decks with a marker, you are going to get grooves in it. So the more you use your marker, the more you're gonna get the groove from the lines. Now I'm gonna show you on, this is my favorite black marker, this is my Prismacolor, and I don't know if you can see right there, if it'll focus, I have grooves in this marker now because I have edged so many decks with it. So when you're putting this thin line into your marker repeatedly, and you're doing that for 78 cards times however many decks, it's bound to wear out. So I'm just gonna show you here real quick. This is what this marker looks like now. Everywhere you see a blank spot or a white spot is where I've worn a groove into it. Once your marker gets to this point, you might as well just chuck it or save it for a different sort of art project, because if you try to use this on a deck, you are most certainly going to get bleed, because that card is going to just go deeper and deeper into those grooves, and you're going to get the bleed on the front or the back depending on which way you're holding the marker. I have accidentally done that to a deck. Now, one other tip I want to give you real quick is that if you happen to get bleed from your marker on the front or back, or somewhere where you don't want the ink, You can, in some instances, use a standard eraser to erase your mark off of the card. Now, it doesn't always work because it depends on the marker and it depends on the cardstock and it depends on the color. But just a quick little tip that if you accidentally get bleed over someplace where you don't want it, try an eraser. And the art erasers, the white ones, I have found really work the best. To talk about a couple of the most important lessons that I've learned in all of my deck edging. So the first thing is that you really need to practice the marker with the marker first. You need to know how it bleeds and you need to know how fast it dries. In other words, you need to know how forgiving it is. So the best way to do that is with those extra cards that come with your deck. And you can see, like, I have a pile of them here, and this is why I keep them, because these end up being my practice cards before I actually work on a deck. Now, before I do that even, if it's a new marker that I'm unfamiliar with or a different type of cardstock that I'm not familiar with, I will use a cheap deck of playing cards to practice first. So the last and probably most important tip of this whole process is to do one card at a time. So as tempting as it might be to take one of these bad boys, these big Sharpies, pick up your deck and just run it all along together, if you do that, you are gonna get a messy bleed on the front and back, and unless you're really going for that messy look, which I've actually done a time or two, you're gonna get just a hot mess in there, and it's gonna stick and it's gonna dry instantly, and it's not a good practice to get into. So as tempting as it may be to take and do this whole deck at once with these fat mamas here, I wouldn't recommend it. Do one card at a time. Just take your time with it. That is the most important lesson, I think, in any sort of deck mod, whether you're trimming it or rebacking it or edging it. Take your time, go slow, and you might as well enjoy the process while you're at it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I hope that you enjoyed this deck mod tutorial and that it was informative and helpful for you. And I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.